How many senses do you have? It's definitely not 5, or I wouldn't be making this video. I'm Will, and you're watching Thinking Linguistically. It's sort of common knowledge that everyone has 5 senses, so vision, hearing, taste, touch, smell. That's obviously wrong. One way we know it's wrong is, for example, in the Buddhist tradition, there's just a different number. You have 6 senses. It's those 5 plus a 6th one. It's sometimes called mind, or I guess you could translate it as intuition just as well. This makes a lot of intuitive sense. Like, you can know things because you perceive them with one of your senses. Like you can see something happen, you can hear something happen. It's weird to think of tasting something happen, but sure, why not? But then you can also deduce that something has happened on the basis of facts, and that would be applying your mind, right? So you can glean information using this 6th sense. That doesn't mean that that's the only way of thinking about it, though. Let me indulge in a brief tangent. In different languages, there are different numbers of verbs for different modes of perception. English has a lot of these. One of the things I'm interested in is Bantu languages, and those tend to have fewer. For example, in some languages, you can use the verb that means to hear, not just for hearing, but for perception generally. So, you can hear a taste or hear a smell. Some of the senses of this perception verb you could even interpret as sensing with your mind sense, which is neat. But there is also another word that's smell, but it's more emit a smell. Or there's also a Western movie about a guy with a 6th sense.
I see dead people.
And that doesn't really make sense. If he has 6 senses, well, then he should be able to see dead people or hear them or smell them. But it seems like he can do all of those. So there's already in this general common knowledge, a notion that other individuals or other beings might have more than 5 senses. When I went to aquarium camp as a kid, we were taught that sharks have 7 senses. They've got the 5 that humans have, but then they also have a lateral line, as all fish do, which is a series of jelly-filled cups with little tiny hairs in them. It's a way of detecting vibrations. And then they have a 7th sense, which is the ampullae of Lorenzini, which are these little pits at the front of the nose. You can see them up close. And those detect electromagnetic fluctuations. This is one reason why, if you go shark diving, sharks tend to bite the cage. They're investigating you because they're interested, but then up close, it makes sense to bite what they feel an electrical current running through, because that's usually a fish, unless it's a cage. Or, a suit of armor, or a license plate, or any of the other fucking weird things sharks eat. So in the Buddhist tradition, you have 6 senses, but the 6th one doesn't really relate to your brain or the world in quite the same way as the other 5. Visible objects, sounds, odors, tastes, and touches, those are things that other people can experience. But mental objects are not things that are accessible to another observer. In order to count mind as a sense, we need to count things inside of the brain as being senses, not just things that originate outside. Right, so you've got your brain and this protective helmet encasing it that we call a skull, and everything gets relayed to that as electrical impulses. The technical term for this is transduction. So your sensory organs perceive things and then turn them into neural signals, because the brain is a big bunch of neurons. But then if we're going to count neural signals as received by the brain, you're going to have way more than 5 senses, right? You've got way more than 5 nerves. There's also the problem that some of the things that we conventionally regard as being different senses run through the same nerve, right? So your sense of balance works based on little otoliths in your ear, which, feel the pull of gravity, and your nerves can detect that. But then that same nerve also processes sound and probably, touch on the ear and other things like that. Okay, so if we're going to count in terms of inputs of a stimulus from outside the brain into the brain, well, that's going to be a whole bunch of different things. It's going to be not just things outside of the body, but also things inside the body, right? You have a sense of hunger and thirst and when you have to pee, and or sense of temperature, vestibular system. The ability to perceive pain is called nociception. There's also proprioception, which is the feeling of where your limbs are. Okay, yeah, those are senses too then. You have a lot of senses that don't correspond to anything in the outside world, at least not directly. This idea that we can pair up sensory organs with particular modalities of stimulus falls apart pretty quickly, right? What is the sensory organ that you have for proprioception? Well, it's that you exist. All right, so maybe instead of counting inputs from outside the brain, we should be more interested in like inputs from outside the organism, right? That would, give you back to the same 5 that are things you perceive about the world around you rather than things you perceive about your own body. That's kind of no good either, though, because sometimes like we regard things as different senses when they actually are responding to the same kind of input, right? So what does your ear do? It detects vibrations. What does your skin do? It detects touch, which is essentially, a non-cyclical vibration. Your eardrum is basically just a touch sensor that is specialized to receive touches in the form of tiny little vibrations in the air. I think we also probably would want to say that like the lateral line of a fish is also just touch. But then if we're going to go by counting like organs or something, then we would want to say like my dog's whiskers are another sense that's different from touch, and that's weird. It's also possible to use a signal in one modality to deduce information about another thing. For example, you can hear the difference between hot water and cold water. Yeah, your ears perceive vibrations, but if you drill all the way down, everything's vibrations. If you pour cold water into a glass, it sounds different than if you pour hot water into a glass. I am not just making this up. I recorded myself pouring water at different temperatures earlier on my phone. I'm going to play you the clips, pouring from the same kettle into the same glass. Here's sample 1. Here's sample 2. To prove it's not a fluke, here's another trial. This time I'm pouring into a bowl instead of a mug. 1. And 2. I'm so sure you can tell the difference that I'm not even going to tell you which one's which. You can also use this as a handy trick to tell when your shower is warm without feeling it. You're used to the sounds, I promise you. A hot shower sounds different than a cold shower. You're just not used to needing to use your ears to figure that out. It's so much simpler and more accurate to touch it, and then you can feel how hot it is. Why does this work? Well, essentially, because thermometers are just speedometers for atoms. You're not hearing thermal emissions directly. What you're doing is hearing other things that are indexicals that correspond to them. And, if you know how to piece those together, you can decode it. The faster the atoms are going, the more thermal energy they have, the different they cause other things to resonate around them, right? It's how far apart or how close together the molecules are has an acoustic effect. Everything has an acoustic effect. That's why being a phonetician is exhausting. I wouldn't know. There's a whole lot of other useful things you can do with your sense of hearing as well. For example, you can fill a water bottle in the dark and tell when it's full without looking, because you can do echolocation. This is basically a form of echolocation. It gets even crazier from here. We don't conventionally teach that people can perceive microwaves, but you absolutely can. That's not some fanciful joke. You can Google the microwave auditory effect. Essentially what happens is when microwaves run through your ears vibrate in a way that you can perceive as sound, but that it isn't sound. The Wikipedia page describes this as the sounds being produced inside the human head without the need for any receiving device. The things that we regard as being different senses are often regarded as different because they correspond to different organs, right? The reason we say lateral line on a fish is different than touch is because the lateral line is there on the organism as a sensor. What does it sense? Well, let's call that a sense. But then sense as defined as modality in that way of what a sensor detects doesn't really line up with evolution, right? There's all sorts of different ways that the brain can receive different bits of information, and evolution over time is going to optimize for whichever ones keep the organisms alive or help them reproduce. Humans can perceive infrasound probably because that's something that sometimes large predators have done over time and deep in our evolutionary history. And that's why we just regard it as generally creepy without necessarily perceiving it as sound. So should we count unease due to infrasound as a separate sense? I don't think so. If you can determine temperature by hearing instead of by using your normal temperature sense, well, should we count that as a different sense? My feeling is no, that's silly. Instead, you should think of it as like the combination of two senses. What you're doing is using mind and hearing together to make an inference.
Let our powers combine.
It's a general characteristic of the mammalian nervous system that we integrate information from multiple senses, which is part of how this works, and partly also where the confusion comes from, right? Your brain is not responding to individual senses as distinct channels. That's an idealization that we use because it's convenient to shrink the problem down to a manageable size. But it's actually doing everything at once. Breaking up senses as apparatus that we use to detect the world is sort of an arbitrary distinction. It's useful, that's why we do it, but it's still pretend. Let me shrink this down to a more linguistic-centric question. So, I don't think you can use senses about your body to do stuff like communicate in a linguistic way, right? There's no way to encode language as pulses of how badly you have to pee or, taste. We do all the time use vision and sound for language, and it's possible to use touch. There's a really cool finding that children with hearing impairments will spontaneously start to babble if they receive sensory input, even if it's translated into another sense, right? So you can take hearing and noise and translate that through a device called a tactile vocoder into, a feeling on the skin. I first learned about this from D. Kimbrough Aller's book, The Emergence of the Speech Capacity. And I was thinking about the applications at the time, as he has been as well in subsequent work, some of which I'll link. But the implications of it for processing sensory information and whether or not to categorize it as linguistic are complicated, to say the least. Humans, even ones that are not fully developed, seem to have no problem translating that back into something like speech. So they will start producing sound as soon as they know that sound exists in the world and realize they can make it. They don't need to perceive it as sound in order to make that connection. This, to me, is extremely trippy. Like, what if we had a device that just rotates all of your senses over by one so that you taste sound and smell colors? We do have that. It's called LSD. Okay, that's actually not just a glib thing. I think one of the mechanisms for psychedelics like that is they remove the impedance between your different neural channels so that you get more bleed over from one sensory input to another. Someone told me the other day that that's also a lot like what a child's growing brain feels like, which seems interesting. So not every sense that you have is useful potentially for communication, right? It doesn't matter how well you can smell. If we don't have the ability to emit smells, well, you're not going to be able to use that to communicate. And same with taste, and same with most of these internal kinds of things. The two that stand out, though, are vision and hearing. And we seem to have relatively little trouble translating things back and forth between those, right? Natural human languages exist in spoken modality. Oh, shit, I hit the microphone. Like, there are natural human languages that have developed in spoken modality, but also in visual modality, like natural sign languages. We also have this thing, writing, where we take the spoken symbols and render them into a visual format. And once you learn how to do that, it's not that hard to translate back and forth. So I think the only senses that matter for language encoding are the ones that can interface with the outside world on a timescale that makes sense for humans to pay attention to. Like, suppose you meet some geological monster life deep in a volcano. It's not going to do you any good if it speaks, if its syllables take 10,000 years apiece. Time is a problem for another video. There's one loose end that's really, really been bugging me, and that's why I'm making this video. Do you have a sense of time? I think the answer must be yes. This further problematizes the idea of like sensory organs, right? Like, what would your sensory organ be that perceives time? I guess you could say the pineal gland, but like, I don't think your perception that one moment has happened after another moment is derived from your circadian rhythm, in kind of the same way that, like, I don't think how your sleep cycle currently is affects how long you think a second it lasts. If that were the case, you would sort of expect that, like, the way people speak would change wildly depending on their perception of time, right? The amount of time separating various articulatory things is one of the key ways that we tell one sound apart from another. You know, the sound ba and the sound pa are differentiated by how long after you release your lips do you start vibrating your vocal folds. And that interval doesn't seem to change based on, you know, how tired you are. Maybe it changes based on how, you know, impeded your sense of time is. I don't know. I don't think I can really do an experiment. Like, I don't know if there's anywhere where it would be legal to give people psychedelics and see if that affects their voice onset time or their segment duration.
What do you get when you cross a horse with an octopus? A stern rebuke from the Ethical Review Committee and an immediate cessation of research funding.
There is a horse with 8 legs, though. It's called Sleipnir, I think. Loki's the father, I think. The pineal gland is also super weird as a notion of being a time organ, because, like, what it does is emit hormones. So that means your way of perceiving the passage of time would be by sending out molecules. And it seems very weird to me to think of, like, emission of molecules as receiving information. There isn't, like, an organized discipline, as far as I'm aware, that is, like, the scientific study of how time works. Horology exists as a word, as does chronology, but chronology is really, like, about ordering of events and is sort of a subset of studying history for the most part. And then horology isn't really the study of time, it's more the study of how you make fancy watches. Anyway, as a linguist, it perplexes me that we can do language through hearing and sound and touch, but not through taste and smell. I don't know that anyone's tried, but it's certainly an interesting thought experiment. In the case of taste, it's tempting to think, well, okay, you're not going to do practical communication with another person by licking. I don't know that the same logic holds for smell. So, yeah, okay, humans, we don't smell so good. That doesn't mean that other species couldn't do scent-based communication. I don't think that there's any species out there that parcels out meaning or reference or, you know, in the kind of the same informational ways that we structure spoken language. But ultimately, that's an empirical question, unless it isn't. I think that means if we're going to use language as a definition for sense, then we would say we have 3 senses. 3 ways you could do these kind of intrinsically human communication systems. 3 ways you can do a grammar. I don't know of any language that is, well, no, I take that back. I do know of a language that's specifically touch-based, but it's a constructed language. And I don't have a lot of details about it. There's also deaf-blind hand sign, where it's signs but perceived by touch rather than vision. So Helen Keller famously knew American Sign Language and was deaf-blind. She learned sign language by touch. It's curious to me that you could use the same grammar, potentially, you know, the same form of sign language, either in a visual receiving medium or in a touch receiving medium. But I guess that's not that weird. You know, you can encode English through writing. That would be visual. You can encode it through speech. That's auditory. Same with any language, except for sign languages. We don't have a good way to write those. I said in my first video that this channel would have some stuff of, like, seeing how the sausage gets made in terms of how academic research gets done. And this video is a part of that. I want to set up this thought experiment that's been bugging me. If humans had an infinitely good ability to receive different odors, perfect olfaction, that wouldn't guarantee us the ability to emit smells. But then the question is, like, well, what if you could? Would we be able to do language in a smell-based medium? There are different ways to frame, I think, the same or equivalent thought experiment. So, like, we could ask why dogs don't have language, and I'm going to talk about that in another video. There's a curious thing that is different between smell and our other senses. When you see things, you can see and cross-reference that easily with the passage of time. You can see an event happen before another event. You can do the same thing with hearing, and crucially we do, right? Like order matters in spoken language in that you can have the same sounds in different order be different words. Cuff and fuck are different things. So spoken language seems to have order hardwired into it in a certain way. Part of this comes from how sound works, right? Sound is vibrations. Vibrations crucially happen over time. You can't discern frequency from a single snapshot. You have to have a time interval. I'm not sure that logic obtains for smell, though, right? If you are going to leave an olfactory signal, like my dog frequently does, that doesn't necessarily give you the possibility to permute the order of the signal components. We can make different words by putting the same sounds in different orders, but I don't think you can put the same notes in an aroma in different orders in the same way. I don't know that you could do syntax through an olfactory medium. Is temporal order crucial? I don't know. But I kind of want to know. Even when we encode spoken language as other things, we keep this order relation going, right? Writing goes left to right or right to left. Both of those are sort of proxies for the passage of time that you would perceive if you were hearing speech. It makes sense that one of those kinds of things would develop from the other, right? You're hearing things in order. You're going to write them down in the same order. Order is easy to transpose in that way. But I don't know if order can transpose to olfaction. I also don't know if that alone gives us an answer to the question of whether smell-based language would be conceptually possible. Anyway, I've been thinking a heck of a lot lately about how big a space of distinguishable possibilities is, and whether there might be, a certain threshold that's what you need in order to have enough permutations to do the kinds of communication systems that we regard as linguistic. We in linguistics are real interested in this question of what defines language, what are the critical properties that make human language different from other communicative systems. It's kind of necessary to understand that to frame the scope of our field. There's a general consensus among linguists and psychologists that other species don't do language in the ways that humans do, right? Your dog can learn to respond to words, but your dog doesn't have a grammar. So humans are hardwired to organize these grammatical systems, and other species are not. And we think that's probably meaningful to somebody. But we've only really looked at that in the auditory medium, right? We do not have the ability to smell well enough to discern nearly the kinds of things that dogs can do. I'll do another video framing this thought experiment more generally, but let me lay out the basic idea first. I think it would be useful if we could put a floor on what sensory capabilities an organism needs in order for it to do a language. I think the conclusion I've come to is you need to have a sense of mind and a sense of time and one other, right? You can use any of various mediums to signal things. They have different advantages and disadvantages. You can hear around corners. You can't see around corners. You can see further than you can hear, though. And both of those give you greater range than touch. So it kind of makes sense that we as humans rely on those two more than touch for doing language. The reason we have those senses is not something about language. Language is a system that's evolved on top of that. Could you do language in other sensory modalities if you had the necessary apparatus to send and receive signals? We humans do not perceive smells as being ordered signals, whereas order is crucial for how we encode language. There are no languages out there where you simultaneously blurt out all of the sounds in a word, the way that a stenographer types a single word with one keystroke. When you do that kind of system, what you lose is order, and so order seems built into how we do language, but I don't know if it's necessary or not. That's one of the things I'm curious about. At first I was thinking that smell is a completely unordered signal. Now I'm not so sure. My buddy Chirag pointed out to me that perfume companies put great effort into figuring out which note of a smell you will perceive first and last and which one will linger. I don't think you can control that. I don't think you could have two fragrances that are exactly the same components but in reverse orders. But there isn't a speed of smell. Like, there can't be. The air travels at variable speeds. If you have an utterance, a signal emission that is ordered, the thing that you send out won't necessarily stay in that order until it's received on the other end. You emit a smell, and then Bohr's law takes over. So how many senses do you have? I don't fucking know. 6, 4, 1, 2, 17, pi, I don't care. All of our senses are, of course, fallible. Whatever sensory modality we're talking about, there's a range that we can perceive, and there's usually things outside of that range. Crucially, in order to be useful for communication, a thing has to fall within not just one of the modalities that our brains can receive information for, but also needs to be structured in such a way that the signal is receivable as a signal. Theoretically, it seems plausible to me to say that you could encode a linguistic signal in any modality as long as it is reconstructible on the other end based on what's in the signal. You know, if you had a better nose, we could do smell-based communication, we would think. So a lot of this boils down then to making a mapping between the sensory signal you receive and the space of representations possible in your grammar. Thanks for watching. If you want to support this channel, please like the video and click subscribe. It really helps me out. Thanks, dog.